Hey, folks, Zach Osterman, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. I kind of forgot my name there for a second. He's Mike Nislake, Bloomington Herald Times. Mike, I would never forget your name. This is Mind Your Banners for August 14th, 2025. Happy birthday to my sister, Amelia. We can do birthday shout-outs now if you want. If you've got any that you want to throw out there. We're going to try and cover a lot of ground in sort of a short space of time today, Mike, and I think we're going to wind up doing this in like a reverse interview format, because for about the last week or so, you have been almost exclusively covering football for us, and I have been almost exclusively covering basketball for us because of the Puerto Rico trip. So we're going to get caught up on football first, and then I think I'm going to sort of kick it over to you, and you're going to quiz me on what I saw in Puerto Rico, primarily the cuisine, which was just tremendous. But let's start with football. Indiana is what now, almost 2 weeks away from its opener. We're talking on Thursday, so basically 2 weeks and 2 days away from its season opener. I think it's fair to say some things have really started to resolve themselves. We know, for example, that Drew Evans is healthy, is sort of fully ready, and I think probably can be pinned in as the starting left guard. You had a story on him today. We talked to him earlier this week about just sort of the injury and his process and coming back from that. I think we have a firm sense of, kind of where things stand at a number of different skill positions offensively. But what are maybe, I guess, if you've got a couple questions, whether it's position groups, whether it's arrangements of things, just questions that you feel like maybe you were looking to get answered about this team that maybe in the last, 7 to 10 days, you feel more confident about what Indiana is going to do?
Well, it's hard. I mean, we see so little of what they actually do. We don't see any sort of live reps against the defense, offense versus defense, 11 on 11. We see handful of reps on air. And so, what the offense looks like, I could not tell you. We've kind of talked about, will they use the running backs as, in the receiving game more? What, do they split tight ends out? How are they splitting those reps up? And I think those are still all questions that we won't know until they start playing. And even in those first 3 weeks, how, I think Old Dominion, they're going to take very, very seriously, but how much do they open the playbook up even after that, before that Illinois game? I think we might not know what this team fully kind of looks like until that first big test in the Big Ten opener. Defensively, I still think there's some position questions. Obviously this week we've covered a lot of Luis Moore's situations in the secondary. At safety, he's sort of fighting for his eligibility, and he'll have another court hearing on August 27th that will likely determine whether he's available for the season. Without him, they're pretty thin back there. They were thin to begin with in terms of number of scholarship players. And without him, you're looking at Byron Baldwin having a huge role. With him, Baldwin could still have a big role in the team, but if Moore's not eligible, Baldwin becomes essential to this team's season. So that's sort of interesting. I know the defense was shorthanded. Signetti talked about during the first scrimmage. They'll have another scrimmage, I believe, this weekend. What will that look like? And I think they're probably pulling back on guys too, not risking some of the veterans that have been through this with him for a long time. There's no reason to, I know Pons got shaken up in the last scrimmage. There's not much Pons needs to prove at this point, or a Kamara or a Fisher. So, getting some of those young guys reps. And I think, outside of safety, I think the biggest question for me would be that defensive front. What it looks like. Landino's moved inside. They've got obviously the transfers. Hosa Wheeler's been talked about quite a bit in terms of being maybe the CJ West replacement. Kellen Wyatt, Bryant Haynes won't be talking to us during fall camp, but did a brief interview with Big Ten when they visited camp and was really high on Kellen Wyatt. And so does he the guy now next to Kamara on the opposite side when Landino was the guy in the spring? Now he's moved over. And obviously they got Stephen Daly as well, Kent State transfer. So still, I think question marks. Still very interested to see what personnel kind of comes together especially in the first team defense week one. But hearing a lot. I think the clear thing is that there's been some names that have popped up that coaches are very excited about. That I kind of mentioned.
I think. It was interesting, and for those who maybe didn't pick up on it, coordinators are not typically made available. Obviously, Big Ten Network gets a little bit more access. Some of that's a favor to the conference. I think some of that is maybe a little bit dictated when BTN is helping pay the bills. But it was interesting to me to hear Haynes just single out Wyatt. I think a lot of fans were interested in Wyatt. Like Wyatt and Daly both commit in the spring. And I think there was a little bit of that sort of like CJ West vibes. Is one of these guys going to be, really meaningful? But Wyatt, I think, was particularly interesting because he's got the Big Ten background and because, I know he's maybe shifting his role a little bit. He was more of a linebacker at Maryland. Indiana's probably going to drop him down to the line more consistently. You would imagine, listen, those end positions are becoming so much more sort of hybrid and versatile every year. But there is just that sort of security that you have of knowing that he knows what the competitive level is, essentially, that he's going to be doing something probably a little bit different. And of course, that is a position that's probably going to benefit from the 3 non-conference games as much as any, because you're going to, like, you think about that learning curve that CJ West needed a year ago. Those guys are going to get 3 games of pretty controlled sort of, opportunity. You would think none of those games will be tremendously difficult for Indiana to win. But hearing Haynes single out Wyatt, I think was something that stuck with me, because we have wondered since the end of last season who is opposite Mikael Kamara. Because you can't ask Kamara to just basically handle all of the defensive line sort of impact responsibility himself. And I think Wyatt is hearing Wyatt singled out like that was just noticeable to me. I think the other thing that, and I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on it, I know we've talked about it from sort of a positional perspective over the last few months, but I think it is fair to say that from the outside looking in, and when I say the outside, I mean like beyond even the confines of the beat, but like more conference wide, more nationally, the attention that Indiana's offensive line is getting. And I think part of that is because the perception is that was kind of the thing that was where the gap was last year, that when Indiana's offensive line faced Michigan, Ohio State, Notre Dame, that was where a really, really good team couldn't quite elevate to the level of great teams, whether it was the individual talent of a Michigan, the players that Michigan had on that defensive front, or it was obviously the collective success of the 2 teams that played for the national championship. I don't want to say not a lot has changed there, because some meaningful things have changed. I think the number one, you do have 3 starters back. We'll see what the Pat Coogan replacing Mike Kadick thing looks like. But at very least, I think if you're Indiana, you feel like, hey, we're replacing one hyper experienced sort of like team captain type personality with another one. Coogan's resume speaks for itself. You have maybe, if things shake out the right way, a little bit more depth there. I think we forget, for example, I think it was easy to forget across the course of last season that Indiana lost both of its starting guards, not just one of them, because Nick Kidwell was going to be the starting right guard, or maybe it was, I can't remember which side he was going to start on, but Kidwell was going to start. He gets injured in the preseason and kind of forgotten in the shuffle, and then they lose Evans as well. So if Indiana has a little bit more luck with health along that offensive line, they'll probably have a little bit more depth. But it does seem like that group is leaving some very positive impressions, I guess, in terms of when, like when the BTN people come through, for example. That group's getting more attention because, like I said, it was perceived to be, maybe the most obvious sort of gap between Indiana and the real, like, top of the sport last year. But it also seems to be one that is turning some heads when, people who aren't, sort of always boots on the ground with IU football get a look at the team. That seems to be grabbing people's attention a little bit more.
First on Wyatt, if they move him around and drop him back in coverage a little more, that would be different than how they used Linnell Carr
Yeah.
or any defensive end, but Linnell Carr would be probably where he kind of swaps out. I think per pro football focus, and this is not sort of 100%, but generally they had Carr dropping back in coverage only 16 snaps last year. He played what was it, over 600 almost. So I mean that would be something new, a new element that brings, and maybe that increases the versatility up front because you're very comfortable, because he had sort of that more of a dual role at outside linebacker type responsibilities at Maryland. So that would be different, but just wanted to kind of point out in terms of what they did last year snap wise, that they didn't do that. But now to offensive line, interesting. Evans, I thought was very honest yesterday in terms of saying he wasn't necessarily at full strength yet. That there's a difference between being 100% and 100% confident, or 100% back. Not risking injury, but not having necessarily the same strength in his leg. Do they try to? A couple of those games they could get up early and give him some reps, get some rest. Old Dominion might not. Do they monitor his workload? I still think that's an open question, especially for the first 3 weeks. Is he said basically he's still feeling like he's knocking off rust every day. So, I don't think that, I think he's trending towards starting, but I don't necessarily think it's a given that he's sort of all the way back right away. Because 9 months with an Achilles injury, and he didn't sort of necessarily reveal exactly the extent of it. But I mean, that's a pretty quick turnaround in terms of timeline, rehab timeline. As for the rest of it, I do think they have more depth. How it all shakes out on the right side, I think, is your biggest question mark. Benson has been, I think, talked about almost exclusively as a right tackle. That's where Zen kind of started out the fall at, and was in the spring, obviously, with Benson out. What's the best grouping there? And that I think will be kind of the biggest question mark. And then, I've asked a couple of times, Signetti, like, what are the markers to know that they've reached or can reach that next level? Like, how do you know? Do you not know until you get to Oregon and face them? Like what's the step between an offensive line that can compete against 10 of the 12 teams, or dominate 10 of the 12 teams on your schedule? What those two, Penn State, Oregon, probably being like the top tier competition that matches up to what they faced against Notre Dame and Ohio State last year. How do you know? And it's hard. Obviously they have more depth. Physically, he thinks they're in a good spot, but like I'm not sure what the markers are to know, or how a coach knows in the preseason if they've they could be trending that way, but then they face them and you don't know. Like, how do you know? That's kind of I haven't gotten a clear answer as to like how a coach kind of how you close that gap, or how you've closed that gap.
Yeah, I mean, like I sort of have that, and I suspect this will be borne out a little bit more quickly in performances, but I think about that almost from the perspective of the quarterback behind them, because it seemed like one of the things that was really front of mind for Curt Cignetti with Fernando Mendoza was learning to trust that line, because, quite frankly, I don't mean to keep sort of beating this drum, but like, he got sacked 41 sacks in 12 games is just a mind-bending number. Like that's nuts. That's crazy. And I think I think that it almost feels like that relationship kind of evolves in tandem. Does that make sense? That like the more that the quarterback gets comfortable, and listen, I think some of it is literally comfortable sitting in the pocket, trusting that the protection's not going to break down because he's conditioned to think it will. It's also comfortable sliding protection pre-snap, or pointing out, making certain calls, helping your center see things so that he can get things arranged pre-snap. It's that overall level of comfort that that I think, like, it feels like those two kind of evolve together. And again, I know there's been a lot of discussion of Indiana's schedule, and we don't have to do the philosophical part of it today. I do think those 3 games are really valuable also, I think, for someone like Mendoza, because there is, in the same way that I think Indiana as much as Western Illinois was obviously far and away the worst team Indiana played last year, I think Indiana needed a game like Western Illinois for a few individuals and for the collective to say, this is what we're capable of. I think I remember you and I walking out of that stadium that night thinking they're going to bury you at UCLA. And there was neither one of us thought, Western Illinois, UCLA, similar talent level, great look, from Western Illinois to get ready. But it was more the idea of that's what that team was capable of. And
we saw a year earlier struggling against Akron. It's like, and then
right, yeah,
those are moments where you can kind of tell
that's not just talent; it's confidence too. And I think that with that line and the quarterback, I think there's a lot of talent there, but I think the confidence, the chemistry, the trust, like I think they have to evolve together is what I'm trying to say.
No, that makes sense. And those are questions since we don't see a pass rush, we can't accurate and obviously the quarterbacks don't go live at all for Cignetti in the offseason. Hard to answer without kind of seeing it. That will be something to follow with Mendoza. Did he pick up bad habits at Cal and can, is an off season where you don't go live? Oh, can you get rid of all those, in that kind of context? And we'll see kind of week one, what it all looks like.
I think not even week one. I think like would it shock you if Indiana had some of the same problems with Old Dominion that it had with Florida International last year? It wouldn't surprise me. Like it wouldn't surprise me if there is a little bit of rust, because listen, this is still a team that at the end of the day, they're probably going to have at least 2 new starters on the offensive line, maybe 3. They're going to have a new starting quarterback. They're going to have probably a new starting running back. Well, they will have a new starting running back. That the rotation will be different. They're going to have a new starting tight end. They may have at least 1 new starting receiver, probably 3 new starting defensive linemen, 1 new starting linebacker, a whole bunch of turnovers. And yes, I understand that a number of these guys are carryovers. Like Elijah Hardy will probably start next to Aiden Fisher. That would be my guess today. He was here a year ago. Tyreek Tucker, I think, will start at the 3 technique. He was here a year ago. But the point is, there's still, Indiana has, I think, actually an enviable amount of returning production in the modern context of like how much teams just turn over naturally. But there are still a lot of guys that are going to be taking their first snap either in a certain position or, as a starter, or maybe in an Indiana uniform on August 31st against Old Dominion. So,
having 3 Americans,
August 30th, sorry, not 31st.
Having 3 All-Americans and 1 at each level on the defense, the level of talent you brought in from the transfer portal, less question marks because you're not bringing in more group of 5 guys. You're mostly focusing on power 4 guys that were productive. I think it would be a surprise if the final score was as close as that game was last year, and if they struggled for more than a quarter. I would be. That would be just because of the gap in talent level should be now more pronounced than it was, last year against any team that they played that, in that non-conference. It's just, I think you should roll with these teams, even if you have sort of schematic miscues or guys, like you said, playing for the first at a position for the first time or starting for the first time. Your talent should carry you. And I think, Cignetti's not going to look past him, but he's going to want to put up a big number, or even if the defense carries the day and you dominate it that way, that's fine. He's just going to want this team to look good because I think he believes in what they're bringing back. So I would be actually a little bit surprised if this thing didn't look a little better than it did last year in week 1.
Any other football business before we flip this and you start interviewing me instead?
Flip the script. No, that's good.
Well, then take it away.
Well, as somebody who has toiled in at Assembly Hall and not seen 3-pointers shot, was the my from gathering, this is from tweets and from just looking at general box scores. There was not any sort of extended video of any of these games. What was that like to see 3-point barrage by Indiana pretty consistently, and it kind of be the defining feature of the offense after what you've experienced in the last decade?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like it is what DeVries promised, and I prefaced whenever I have talked to anybody about what I saw down in Puerto Rico, I have prefaced it by saying that everyone should remember this game was played in international rules, which meant that the 3-point line was a little bit different. I think Indiana maybe struggled with that a little bit. It also meant that they were playing with a 24-second shot clock. So the game was, I know DeVries has talked about playing faster and more open. 12 seconds? He wants his offense to generate a good shot within 12 seconds. The game also, just by its nature, was going to be played a little bit faster, a little bit more in transition, a little bit more wide open. But having said all that, I mean, in that first game against Central Universidad de Bayamón, who, was very much just kind of like a warm-up. Like if they ran a post up, and I was trying to update our live blog, take some video, all this. So I probably missed one, but if they ran a post up, I didn't see it, and they posted up a little bit more, particularly in game 3. It was noticeable that the offense didn't necessarily function as well when they did. It is a motion-based offense. And it's really easy to sort of say, oh, it's the motion offense and not kind of get into what that means. What it means is that the ball is always moving, and then all the bodies off the ball are moving as well. And the idea is that you're trying to synchronize that movement to create shots. That was very clearly designed around 3-pointers, and I have the box score somewhere. They took, I think, something like an average of like 28 a game. And again, these were higher possession games than, I think it was even higher than that, but these were higher possession games than what they'll play in.
But even if you take 10 away of those, I mean, it's
they had against Bayamón, which was a team that they totally could have just ball screen, ISO, drive downhill, lob, dunk, layup, get fouled. Like the athletic level was so much greater that they could have gotten away with that. But they took, I think, 33 3-pointers in that game. The only time in the last 3 years that an Indiana team at any point in a game that counted took more than that was when Indiana lost at Nebraska last year. They took 35. So, like, first time out of the gate, Indiana was taking more threes than it almost ever took in Mike Woodson's tenure, really.
And that could be closer to the baseline that they have.
No, I think it probably will be. And again, what stuck out to me, and this is part of what I wrote after that game, what stuck out to me about that was they didn't have to do that. Like, yeah, they could have just
physically dominated.
You don't want to sort of like make single moments indicative of wider trends. And Darren DeVries, kind of joked afterward. I don't think he was joking, but he found it funny that he really would rather Enright have just taken the layup. But like there was in the third quarter, Indiana turned Bayamón over and Enright leaked out down the right side. And somebody just threw kind of this lazy pass over to him. And he had Tucker DeVries to his left and he had a defender cutting to the rim, but it was pretty clear the defender was like not, the defender was not like going to really contest. Basically, he could have had probably a pretty easy layup or maybe gotten fouled. And instead, the minute his feet hit the paint, he kicked it out to Tucker DeVries for a 3. And DeVries missed the 3, but it was kind of the point was...
It's been hammered home to them.
Yes, he was sticking with, this is the shot we're looking for. Now, again, Darren DeVries says afterward, we'd probably just take the 2, under other circumstances. But, there was a clear sort of distinction of, this is, even up to, and I think DeVries talked about the drive and kick drills that he does in practice, and we saw those in the open practice before they went down to Puerto Rico. They do a variation of that even during warmups. So again, like there is so much focus on, corner threes, wing threes, the way the ball moves to go find those shots. If I'm not mistaken, Lamar Wilkerson took the most field goal attempts across the course of the entire trip. I mean, and he's when he's going, he's a remarkable shooter. It is just like stylistically, everyone expected this, at least sort of broadly speaking. But I think what was demonstrated in Puerto Rico was how much this roster has bought into it, and how committed they are to staying with it through, no matter what.
You touched on it a little with the first team, and I won't butcher their name, but it seemed like even from photos, and this is I'm not trying to be insulting, but it seemed like they had the size of like
they lost by 51,
but it was like the size of a high school team,
Yeah.
And what was the you don't have to go too deep, but in terms of like, I think you mentioned kind of context to these is important. Obviously, they had two big comeback wins over, was it Megabat?
Mega Super Bet, yeah.
Mega Super Bet, Mega Super Robot Bet. What was the competition like? What would you compare them to sort of give fans? Like you said, you don't want to take too much from exhibitions, but what was the competition level like that they were facing?
I would say probably at least a good mid-major team, if not maybe a lower level high major team. Now, I also make this point when people have asked me about this. It's their preseason too, and I think these games mean something to them. I think they're motivated to try and, go over and play college teams from the States and try and beat them and all that. And for example,
well, it could be NBA film too, like scouting film. When
you're I'm guessing, for example, that they did more practice preparation adjustment between games 1 and 2 than Indiana did, because Indiana wanted to win these games, but as Darren DeVries has said, is kind of we all picked up on down there, Indiana was not living and dying by whether or not they won these games. The practices were the biggest benefit from the preseason tour, and I think from DeVries' perspective, all the stuff away from basketball, where these guys were only around each other for an entire week, and all the stuff that you saw them doing, the sailing and the jet skiing and the food tours, like that, I think was genuinely in some ways as important to him as the games themselves. So it probably mattered a little bit more to Mega, but it is important to remember that it's their preseason too. And if I'm not mistaken, I was reading something in the build up to the trip. I think they lost 5 kids to college basketball this year. So their roster has turned over a decent amount. Now, they still do have a kid on their roster, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Bogoljub Markovic, one of the two, who was drafted by the Bucks this summer. So they have another kid who was their leading scorer in the first game. His last name, I think, was Julovic, who is an NBA prospect, and he looks like one. He's 6'5", 6'6", really solidly built, handles well, shoots well. There's a kid on their roster who played at Georgia last year, if I'm not mistaken, and then at least 2 or 3 more who are getting high major recruiting attention, because that's becoming obviously a more well-worn path in sort of like the post rev share era. The point is, there's still talent on that roster. It got turned over a decent amount, is my understanding, between the end of last season and what we saw. So they were probably still going through some of the same growing pains Indiana was. And I do think you could see a pronounced difference in the physical and conditioning level. Like in the first game when Indiana was down 23 and came back and won by 22, they just looked exhausted. They looked like they just couldn't run with Indiana anymore. By about the midpoint of the third quarter, they got up in that game because they were leveraging their size advantage, and they had one. And their bigs could all shoot. So anytime Indiana was slow to close out or lost a big man, in the half court, they were getting burned. But they looked just gassed by the end of, I would say, the third quarter of that game. In the Saturday night game, the big sort of swing, I think Indiana ended that game on a 70-19 run or something like that. But they definitely posed Indiana some problems. I think they were able to leverage Indiana's lack of size at times. They definitely had Indiana scrambling because they could shoot the ball fairly well. They had Indiana scrambling in some defensive situations where there were breakdowns in communication or rotations, and I think you still see Indiana struggling at times defensively. So it was a good. I mean, it was a genuinely, like I said, I would say, like not knowing everything about their roster, I would guess that they would not finish last in the Big Ten.
So that's a good. I mean, it's a good test. It's a worthy test as opposed to not 3 games against a team like that first one they faced where you probably couldn't get anything out of it. Where you're just running up and down the floor. In terms of, you mentioned Wilkerson, I think he had the game-winning play on both ends in the third game. Caught fire a couple times. Was he just by far the most impressive player to you, or was there a guy? And we should say Nick Dorn made the trip but didn't play. Jason Drake did not make the trip, and one of the 2 most recent international transfers still isn't with the team. So they had 3 guys out. Everybody else was there, right, and participated. But anybody else? Who's the standout guy? And was there anybody unexpected that you were sort of surprised by their performance? So start with, who was the most impressive through the 3 games?
Yeah, I mean, the most impressive through the 3 games was probably Wilkerson and Tucker DeVries. And Tucker DeVries didn't actually score the ball very well, but, and this shouldn't be surprising, he kept turning up wherever the action was. You could tell he just knew.
Heavy veteran, which makes sense considering.
Well, and he knows his dad's offense. Frankly, he knows his dad's defense. I think we frame it so much as like, oh, he knows what the offense. Well, he knows what the defense is supposed to do too. And I thought he had some really important defensive possessions. Another one that actually stood out to me was Sam Alexis. He didn't start any of the 3 games, but he had something like 38 points and 23 rebounds across 3 games, and in different ways was a really meaningful.
We came out of that first practice. I said, look, he'd be sneaky. I said that.
No, I mean, he's really good. He is a classic, like, rim to rim big. He's really good defensively around the rim. And then, he was great in like screen and roll situations.
He's got all the athleticism to sort
and Bailey is a much more sort of offense focused big, which, that can work. We did not see much of them playing together. DeVries had it a little bit, but we didn't see much of it. I don't think that's going to be a feature this year. It might have some, but I think it's going to kind of be one or the other a decent amount.
So does he qualify as the surprise guy that you weren't expected, or
maybe? I actually would, in different ways, also mention both freshmen. Sisley, I know we were both sort of like, yeah, he looks like he doesn't look out of place. Like he looks like he belongs here, which on a team that, okay, it's brand new, but a lot of these guys have played a lot of college basketball, that he does not look like athletically or skills-wise sort of overwhelmed by what's going on.
It almost looked like he had went through an offseason in the weight room when we saw him.
Yeah, like he's
that's what it looked like to me. Yeah.
He looked like he fit, and he even had like he had the same sort of confidence that some of the older players have. Like there was a moment when he was defending a player who was posted up, and they were hand fighting, I think, while he was trying to deny the entry pass. And the Serbian player, the mega player, I guess I don't know if he's Serbian, but the player from the Serbian team, hooked his arm and then intentionally went to the ground to make it look like Sisley had pushed him down. The referee didn't fall for it. The referee saw it. He whistled him for an offensive foul. And when Sisley saw that he was getting the call his way, he like barked down at the kid. Like he, basically was just like, yeah, don't try that again. That something like that. Like he was, there was no sort of reservation or freshman hesitation from him. Now these games are, totally risk-free, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you win or lose, all that. But it's, it is definitely still, I think, encouraging to see a freshman that doesn't look like a freshman in a lot of respects. And then, I mean, Ristich, for the fact that like DeVries even admitted like multiple times he called stuff and then was like, oh, he doesn't know what that is yet because he'd only been with the team literally in days. He could count it in days. Like he looked composed. I thought he had a good feel for the pace of the game. He didn't get sped up. He can shoot. I mean, I really like it, and I'm not trying to make it out like he's going to be freshman All Big Ten. I think you still got some developing to do. Not
When
least
you step off the plane and you're already kind of in the mix, I mean, it speaks to your.
Well, and Indiana had to because they didn't have Jason Drake, and maybe Nick Dorn starts long term, but like he wasn't there, so you had Enright, Wilkerson, and Connerway all in the starting lineup together. You basically only had one guard on the bench. And anytime any one of those guys got in foul trouble, and they all had some foul trouble, I think because they weren't great in terms of knowing like how to adjust to the way the game was being called because it was under FIBA rules. You know, Enright and Conway both had some foul trouble, so Ristich just had to play a lot of minutes. And I just thought for a kid who did not know the team, did not know the stuff, like, you know, had literally just settled in here, I think he looked impressive. And the question is basically, like, you know, can he continue that? You know, so.
And we can end here. You know, I think there's obviously reason for optimism after how well they played and kind of the game plan they're building, or DeVries has kind of put in place, and the talent they've accumulated. But in terms of concerns, when you kind of you know, hit the airport in Atlanta on the way home, when you kind of looked at, you know, we've talked about kind of defense, about size, kind of after watching that one practice that we saw. What are, I guess maybe, you know, just from seeing them play 3 games, your biggest kind of concern now, having a little bit more feel? I mean, you've seen them 4 times. Just maybe a concern or two, just based on what you've seen so far of Indiana.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
And are they the same? Is it just defense and size?
Yeah, I mean, schematically, like, they're going to have to mitigate their lack of size all year. And not everyone will be set up to take advantage of that. And, you know, listen, we saw Indiana play such big lineups the last 2 or 3 years that we forget that there's lots of teams that don't play that big, you know, and especially in college. But, like, you know, they've only got, unless Asimovich is just a revelation because he's listed at 6'11", they're only going to play basically 2 players that are 6'9" or taller. And one of those, Bailey, again, I think is a much more offense-minded, you know, big man than he is defense. Not that he can't defend, not that he can't rebound, but it's not, you know, the sort of Trace Jackson Davis, Umar Ballo, Kalel Ware. We're going to have a dominant big man in the paint that is really good in the screen and roll and is incredibly difficult to score over or rebound against. You know, there's not going to be, at least on this team, that role. That may not even be a feature going forward for Darren DeVries, but this roster is going to have to mitigate it. And I think even DeVries recognizes that. I think, you know, from those games specifically, maybe it's just what they were doing down on the island. You know, I don't want to assume this is a consistent problem, but like they did start slowly in all 3 games. And some of that was defense. Some of it was, again, adjusting maybe to FIBA rules and things like that. Some of it was, frankly, that the offense just wasn't like clicking right away, whether it was stuff wasn't being run crisply or shots weren't going in or whatever. You know, you deserve credit for coming back in those 2 games against Mega, but there's a reason they were down 20 points or more.
How many times did we have that conversation last year and last 2 years?
Well, and even by Amon, like, I wouldn't necessarily say they started like a house on fire. They just, over time, their athletic and skills advantages just completely wore them down until the game did become a bit of a layup line in the second half. You know, maybe that is just the way they were approaching these games. Maybe that changes as things go on. I don't know. But I think that, you know, if I'm Darren DeVries, that's probably one of the things I put a star next to when I'm evaluating this film is to just say, like, why were we so sluggish, whether it's pace, shooting, whatever, to start these games? Because we can't, you know, afford to be digging ourselves a hole.
Or time in the sun. They might not have that problem come November.
Right. I mean, like, I'm not,
no, but seriously, I mean,
I'm not trying to pull back the curtain too much. Like, I'm pretty confident they were still doing excursions like the day of games.
That's what I'm saying. Like, they probably won't be doing, like, you know.
Yeah. And again, I think Mega did more adjusting between games 1 and 2 than Indiana did. Like
Right.
the games were important to Indiana, but like they did not schedule the preseason tour so they could play these games. They scheduled the preseason tour so that they could have 10 extra practices, and then they could take the team away, just the team, for a whole week to build, some of that, essentially some of that, sort of chemistry and whatever. But yeah, I would, in terms of like the way the game's played out, they need to, if there is something that they can identify as a reason why they were starting slowly, they need to get that out of their system.
Fair enough. It was a good breakdown, and your coverage was excellent. So I hope readers followed along.
Well, your coverage was excellent.
You need to button your extra button on those videos, though. That was no good. No
but then it was like all the way up here.
And yeah, but you're like, your whole chat, nobody wants to
see. I'm on the island. I mean, it's,
I flagged the content on YouTube as inappropriate. So
I mean, I'm not going to be doing one of these.
That's what you're doing. That's what you're doing.
After like Nebraska in December, I'm not going to be like, but I'm down in the islands. Like
I flagged it as inappropriate. I hope YouTube takes the proper action.
I'm Jimmy Buffett. Okay. It just is what it is. He's Mike Neidlich. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners for August 14th. 2025, we'll be back. Next week we'll probably need to start talking about actual games of football. So we'll be back before it was the rum. Brenton Fender says it was the rum. Really quickly, Troika does ask, were there Indiana fans at the games? Yes, not a ton. It wasn't like the Bahamas in 2021 where it was like you could sell the idea of like you're going to a resort. It's all self-contained. There were probably, I would say, at least 50 Indiana fans at each game, like 40 to 50. The biggest crowd was the Saturday night game where they got a bunch of Indiana fans, and then also just a bunch of like local fans came out because basketball is really popular in Puerto Rico, and that was a lot of fun. That was probably a few hundred people would be my guess. But it wasn't quite the same as the Bahamas, where that was so like specifically tailored toward why don't you all come down and just make a vacation out of this, because it's all just in one resort essentially. So we'll be back next week. Till then, he's Mike Neidlich. I'm Zach Osterman. Stay cool. And, listen to Mind Your Banners twice. Like and subscribe. We'll talk to you soon.